All right, let's move on to the San Francisco 49ers.
Okay.
We don't hear much about the 49ers. All their draft picks were gone.
Yeah.
Christian McCaffrey and all the wheeling and dealing of the San Francisco 49ers. So they didn't pick until pick 87. Jair Brown, safety out of Penn State.
Still picked 9 times.
Yeah, they did. A lot late. The first kicker off the board, Jake Moody out of Michigan. They at least got, I think, probably the best one. Cameron Latu, the tight end out of Alabama, goes pick 101. Again, it was this weird tight end class where I think there was just solid tight ends. Latu goes a little bit higher than expected there. Darrell Luter, there's a potential sleeper type guy that I did like out of South Alabama, the cornerback. D. Winters, the linebacker in round 6 out of TCU. A lot of people did like him. Production was up and down, but he has those plays where he flies around the field, and the Niners have done a nice job developing linebackers. Ronnie Bell, wide receiver out of Michigan, goes round 7, pick 253, way lower than I think people expected there. He was at least a 4th, 5th round consideration, I think, on a lot of boards. And their last pick, Jalen Graham, the linebacker out of Purdue, is fast sometimes.
Yeah.
Has some speed on the field that shows up every now and then.
This draft felt a lot like the Patriots draft from a year ago when almost everybody hated it. And you look at the theme and it's like we reached or drafted players that were, non-valuable positions, or we did both at the same time, and you end up with this totality of picks that everybody just doesn't like.
Yeah, I think, is this where I haven't looked at consensus grades or anything like that? I assume not too many people love the Niners.
I doubt it. I mean, yeah.
Jair Brown is interesting. He's a box safety type. I think every safety had people that loved him and people that didn't love him so much. So he was one of those guys. The people that loved him loved how he flies around the field and makes a ton of plays in and around the line of scrimmage. He is probably limited as a box type of player. You already have Talanoa Hufanga there in San Francisco. So again, in the 3rd round, a lot of teams are not saying like, here's my projected starter. And that's what makes, I think that's what fans want to see, right? They want to see your first pick, even in round 3. It's like, this guy's going to contribute right away. Other than Jake Moody, the kicker, who contributes right away for the Niners. I'm not saying judge the draft by that.
Yeah.
I'm saying that's why the feels aren't there for the Niners.
Yeah, I mean, you can compare it in a lot of ways to the Rams draft, right? Where both teams had kind of traded away a lot of picks. They weren't picking particularly high, and then they had actually quite a large volume of picks later on. But one of the differences between the two is that the 49ers, from a roster standpoint, are just in a much better place than the Rams. So you look at the Rams, and part of loving that draft is, I mean, there's a pathway to so many of these guys actually playing a lot or starting right away, in large part because the Rams just had that many holes in the roster. And it's like, they'd backed themselves into a corner where they needed to come out of the draft with quite a few players that can start or contribute year one. The 49ers aren't really in that position. Like, it's a good roster. So part of it is they're unlikely to come out of this draft with a bunch of players where you're like, oh, that guy's going to start year one, because there isn't the space.
I think, yeah, I mean, there's definitely a combination of, because the Rams have so many holes, are we a little biased in saying, look at all these guys, they're all going to play this year?
Right.
And we look at the Niners and it's like, none of these guys are going to play because they already have all their starters.
That being said, I think there were places that they could potentially have brought in starters. I mean, that offensive line is actually not in tremendously good order right now. It'll look a little bit better because it's in a Kyle Shanahan offense, but there's multiple starters in that offensive line that a guy in the 3rd round could easily challenge. And yet they spent, the 3 third-round picks on a safety, a kicker, and a tight, like obviously a backup tight end because George Kittle is there, but a reach at a backup tight end. So it's a combination of both, I think. It's never going to look as good because the pathway to playing time for these guys isn't as clear as it is for some other teams. But even with that, we were talking pre-draft, right? That the 49ers is actually a really fun team to use the mock draft sim for because they don't pick for ages, and then you have that sort of 3 and 4 at the back of the 3rd round that can really do you something. And they traded up, right? Didn't they trade up for Jair Brown? Like they were at the,
May
the
have.
back
Yeah,
of the
I don't
3rd.
have all that.
They had 3 picks in 4, and that's not the way it ended up. I think they ended up trading up for Jair Brown as well. So, yeah, I don't think it's ever going to feel as good, but even with that baseline, it feels like that trio of picks to begin with is a bit of a whiff.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how J.R. Brown does fit in there. You know, everything from everything he did at free safety, angles, tackle attempts, kind of ugly, overruns plays. Everything he does in and around the line of scrimmage, physical in the run game, had a high run stop percentage. He did have good ball skills when given the opportunity. I'm certainly willing to concede safety evaluations that those guys can outperform versus maybe other positions where you trust the data a little bit more. But the data's okay on J.R. Brown, and it's certainly more conducive to playing in the box. But if that's what they get from him, and then Moody as a kicker, I'm not as against kickers once you get to like round 5 or whatever. When you're a top 100 pick as a kicker, there's certainly more risk associated with that. Moody with two years though of PFF field goal grades above 90, that's at least a good start.
Well, he at least
But that's why it feels worse. By the way, they didn't have they had 2 top 100 picks and they used 1 on a kicker.
Yes, it's got to be the highest kicker pick since Aguayo, right?
There's other third rounders, isn't there? Was it that high? It didn't feel crazy at the time, but I mean it's higher than I would normally expect kickers. But I don't know if that.
I mean, if you're taking a kicker on day 2. Which is what we're talking about. Forget day 1. Let's assume that should be off the table outside of the Al Davis world. If you're taking a kicker on day 2, you're putting an insane amount of pressure on that guy to be amazing. But at least Jake Moody, unlike Roberto Aguayo, actually has, the PFF grading data that says he's been really good the last couple of years. Aguayo didn't even have that. He just had a couple of really big, high-profile clutch kicks, and everyone's like, we can kind of overlook the rest of it. Moody has got a very good profile for a college kicker over the last 2 years. The problem is that the data would essentially say, not that it's random, but it's very difficult to predict who good NFL kickers are going to be. It's Justin Tucker, and then everybody else just has these random years where they're really good, and then they stop being really good, and then maybe they come back and be really good again, but by that time, you might have gotten rid of them because they missed 2 critical kicks for your team, and they're on to the next team. Like Daniel Carlson is one of the better kickers in the NFL right now. The Vikings had to get rid of him because he couldn't kick for a brief period. Like, that happens to almost all of these guys. So for you to take a kicker in the 3rd round, you're kind of relying on the idea that he's going to be on the Justin Tucker side of this thing, which is pretty rare.
The other things to maybe highlight here, I mentioned Darrell Luter Jr. from South Alabama. I think he does have actually a chance to compete at outside corner where they're still not necessarily locked in there. D. Winters, I mentioned earlier from TCU. A lot of people did like him. He hasn't graded above 55 PFF grade since 2020. So again, he was one of those like, hey, you're going into the national title game. A lot of people are buzzing about D. Winters from TCU. The grades weren't great, but he's a 6th rounder. And then because it's Kyle Shanahan, keep an eye on Braden Willis, the tight end H-back out of Oklahoma. Maybe a Juszczyk replacement at some point or complement. So you've got at least a guy who really graded well as a run blocker, pass blocker in the 7th round that Kyle Shanahan might make use of.
So if you
trying to skew positive here toward the end.
If you compare, PFF big board ranking and the consensus board ranking to their actual draft position, they reached on almost everybody in this draft. Does the model like any of these players?
Darrell Luter.
Yeah?
Luter's the guy. So we had him as the big board I'm looking at had him at 185. That's a 6th rounder. And a dark green. Guy that you would take anytime in the 6th or the 5th makes sense. Get him in the 5th. So that's why I'm saying I think he might have an opportunity to play.
Yeah.
And he was actually, interestingly enough, the guy that we liked, Mekhi Blackman, who went much higher. Similar spot as far as model and similar spot as far as where the consensus board had them. But, so I like Luter.
Okay.
How's that?
Yeah, good.
For positivity.
There you go.
All right, let's. What do we give them?
C-.
C- for the San Francisco 49ers.
I assume is as low as we gave.
Don't talk to me. Talk to PFF.